I was scrutinized for such a long time. That's what Camilla said when she finally acknowledged what it felt like to spend years under the kind of public attention most people couldn't survive for a week. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a defense. It was a quiet admission from a woman who'd spent decades being discussed, criticized, photographed, and blamed, while almost everyone around her had already told their side of the story. Charles spoke on television about the breakdown of his marriage. Diana described the presence of another woman. Royal aides briefed reporters, biographers published accounts, even Diana's younger son, decades later, added his own accusations, but Camilla never gave the public the one thing millions believed they were owed, her complete version. And perhaps that's exactly why so many people assumed they already understood her. In September 1997, days after Diana's death, only 13% of British adults viewed Camilla favorably. When asked whether she should ever become queen, 86% said no. Not uncertain, not reluctant, no. And yet years later, Buckingham Palace released a coronation invitation decorated with hand-painted flowers and family symbols. At its center appeared two words that would have seemed unthinkable to that 86%, Queen Camilla. So how did that happen? How did a woman so many people couldn't forgive move from the edges of royal life to the center of a coronation? Was her silent strategy? Was it guilt? Was it something else entirely? Because the closer you look, the more uncomfortable this story becomes. There were carefully arranged public appearances, palace advisors engineering her image behind the scenes, private losses that barely made the news, years of charity work that began before she ever married Charles. And moments when she did speak, just never in the way her critics expected. We're going to follow the evidence through official royal records, parliamentary statements, archived opinion surveys, authorized biographies, documented interviews, and the independent investigation into how Diana's most famous television appearance was obtained. We'll examine what Diana actually said, what Charles admitted, what Camilla acknowledged, and what nobody can honestly claim to know for certain. We'll see why the Queen eventually overturned the future everyone thought had already been decided. And we'll confront an uncomfortable truth. Even after Camilla received the crown, the argument around her never ended. But first, we need to go back, before the headlines, before the accusations, before Diana ever walked down the aisle. Back when Camilla wasn't a symbol, she was someone's daughter, someone's sister, and eventually someone's wife. And Charles was already there. If you value royal stories told with the facts behind the headlines, please like this video and subscribe. Now, let's return to where Camilla's story began. Camilla Rosemary Shand was born on July 17, 1947, at King's College Hospital in London. No crowds outside, no photographers. Nothing about her arrival suggested her name would one day divide a country. Her father, Major Bruce Shand, had been decorated with the Military Cross during the war. Her mother, Rosalind, came from the Cubitt family, with deep connections to the British aristocracy. But the Shand household wasn't defined by ceremony. It revolved around countryside routines, horses, dogs, long walks, and muddy boots. Camilla grew up in East Sussex alongside a younger sister, Annabelle, and a brother, Mark. Books mattered in the house. So did the outdoors. She became comfortable around horses early and carried a private love of reading with her long after her life became far less private. The Shands were well connected and financially comfortable, familiar with the social circles surrounding Britain's upper classes, but they weren't living inside Buckingham Palace. Nobody was preparing Camilla to wave from balconies or have strangers inspect every expression on her face. She attended school in England, continued her education in Switzerland and France, and returned to London to move through a world of parties, country weekends, and friendships that regularly overlapped with royal circles. That overlap matters, because years later, Camilla would sometimes be discussed as though she'd appeared out of nowhere in Charles's life, pushed her way in, and refused to leave. The history tells a different story. She already belonged to a social world Charles knew intimately. Their families and friends moved through the same places. The distance between them wasn't between a prince and a stranger. It was the much shorter distance between two people whose lives had been brushing against each other for years. Their introduction is often repeated incorrectly. You've probably heard they met beside a polo field. It's an easy image, Charles in sporting clothes, Camilla nearby, a convenient beginning for a story the public would later know too well. Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography of Charles gives a different account. They were introduced through a mutual friend, Lucia Santa Cruz, the daughter of a Chilean diplomat. That distinction matters because a polo match makes the meeting sound like chance. An introduction through a mutual friend places them exactly where they belonged, inside an interconnected social circle where families already knew one another. They met around 1971. Charles was in his early 20s. Camilla was slightly older. Their friendship became romantic in surroundings that felt natural to both of them. But Charles wasn't the only man in Camilla's life. And when the moment came for her to marry, he wouldn't be the one waiting beside her. The man Camilla married was Andrew Parker Bowles, an army officer who'd been part of her world for years. He was confident, established, and connected to royal circles himself. Members of the royal family knew him through military service, shared friendships, and the traditions surrounding Britain's social elite. By early 1973, Charles had joined HMS Minerva for an overseas naval deployment. 2 months later, Camilla and Andrew became engaged. Those facts are documented. What isn't established is the more dramatic version sometimes attached to them, that shadowy palace figures deliberately sent Charles away to break up the couple. Biographers have described disapproval and complicated expectations, but an attractive theory isn't the same thing as proof. On July 4, 1973, Camilla Shand married Andrew Parker Bowles at the Guards Chapel in London. Princess Anne attended. So did Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Those guests tell us something important. Camilla wasn't standing outside the gates of royal society hoping someone would let her in. She was already known within it. Charles wasn't at the wedding. He was away with the Navy. Over the next few years, Camilla built a life that had nothing to do with being the future king's companion. In 1974, she gave birth to a son, Tom. In 1978, her daughter Laura arrived. She was raising children, managing a household, building friendships, living a life defined by family, not by the heir to the throne. Tom and Laura weren't footnotes to someone else's royal story. They were the center of their mother's own, and yet the old connections remained. Charles became Tom's godfather, a fact that reveals just how closely these lives continued to overlap. It didn't automatically prove an affair, but it showed that Charles hadn't vanished from Camilla's wider world. Here's where the story becomes more uncomfortable. Relationships don't always disappear because the calendar changes or a marriage takes place. Sometimes people remain connected through friends, families, invitations, and habits established years earlier. Accounts of Charles and Camilla during the later 1970s describe renewed closeness. The private details aren't something any outside narrator can present as if a camera had been in the room. What we know is that Camilla had built her own life, and Charles remained at its edges. She wasn't a woman sitting at home waiting for a prince to return. She had a husband, children, responsibilities, and an identity that existed beyond him. But their earlier relationship hadn't simply vanished without consequence either. Their lives continued to touch. And by the time Charles turned toward a younger woman who seemed to represent the future the royal family wanted, Camilla was already established as a wife, a mother, and someone who understood his world completely. That younger woman was Diana Spencer, and she was about to walk into a marriage whose history hadn't begun with her. When Diana Spencer married Charles on July 29, 1981, she was 20 years old. Charles was 32. Outside St. Paul's Cathedral, crowds gathered for a ceremony that seemed to offer exactly what the public wanted: a young bride, a future king, and the promise of a royal marriage that would carry the monarchy forward. For millions watching, Diana looked like she was stepping into a story written especially for her. She wasn't. Charles already had a long personal history, established friendships, familiar routines, relationships Diana was still learning to understand. Camilla knew that world. Diana was being introduced to it while the entire country watched. That gap mattered more than the wedding photographs suggested. A year later, Diana gave birth to William, then Harry, in 1984. From the outside, the picture seemed complete. 2 young princes, official photographs, overseas visits, the image of a family settling into its expected role. But public recognition didn't mean Diana felt secure. As she later explained in her own accounts, the marriage didn't feel as protected or exclusive as the public assumed. Camilla's continued place in Charles's wider circle became a source of deep distress. Now, one of the most disputed questions in the entire history of this marriage is when Charles and Camilla resumed a physical relationship. Charles later said it happened only after his marriage had irretrievably broken down. Diana's recollections suggest Camilla's presence troubled her well before any date Charles offered as an explanation. Those positions aren't identical. One concerns a physical timeline, the other concerns how Diana experienced the emotional reality of her marriage every single day. A relationship can feel threatened long before anyone outside it can pinpoint when an affair began. I want to handle that distinction carefully here and then move on, because repeating it every 5 minutes would insult your intelligence. You understand that private rooms weren't recorded. You understand that personal accounts carry emotional truth while leaving some questions unanswered. You understand that contested history doesn't resolve into one clean version just because a narrator wants a tidier story. So when we reach moments later where different accounts conflict, know that I'm applying the same standard throughout. I'll tell you what can be established, what can't, and let the evidence speak. What can be established without any doubt is this. Diana described herself as profoundly unhappy. She spoke about isolation, pressure, and the strain of maintaining a marriage that looked very different from the inside, and Camilla's name became central to how she explained that pain. For someone as young as Diana, the imbalance has to be understood in human terms. She'd married into a family governed by duty and expectations that had existed long before her arrival. Charles had people around him who understood his preferences and history without needing anything explained. Camilla was among them. Diana, meanwhile, was trying to learn the rules while raising 2 children and performing a public role that offered almost no privacy when things became difficult. The palace kept presenting the marriage through the language of appearances, engagements to attend, charities to support, photographs to stand for. From the outside, the routine continued. Inside the marriage, Diana would later describe a growing distance that no official schedule could repair, and eventually, by her own account, she decided she could no longer stay silent in the presence of the woman she believed stood between her and her husband. The moment she described didn't happen at a palace ceremony or in front of television cameras. It happened at a private gathering, among people who already knew each other, and Diana would later say she walked directly toward Camilla. The gathering was in 1989, connected to the 40th birthday of Camilla's sister, Annabelle. The account that survives comes from Diana herself, shared through Andrew Morton's work. No verified transcript exists, and Camilla never publicly offered a competing version. According to Diana, she approached Camilla and made clear that she understood the nature of the relationship with Charles. "I know what's going on between you and Charles, and I just want you to know that." In Diana's telling, Camilla questioned what more she could possibly want. She had public admiration, 2 sons, the position everyone associated with privilege and security. Diana's answer was 4 words. "I want my husband." Those words have lasted because they cut through everything else: the titles, the attention, the formal clothes, the expectations. What remained was a wife saying that the life everyone admired from a distance didn't feel like hers when she was living inside it. For viewers who watched Diana during those years, the account gave recognizable shape to something they'd already sensed. Her unhappiness wasn't only about public pressure or the difficulty of royal duties. By her own description, it was about believing another woman occupied emotional space inside her marriage. And once Diana's account became public, the country didn't need much encouragement to decide which woman it felt protective toward. A young wife asking for her husband was simpler to understand than the complicated history of relationships that existed before the marriage began. But 1989 wasn't only important because of Diana's confrontation. That same year, a private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla was recorded. At the time, nobody outside their circle had heard it. The country didn't know a separate piece of evidence existed, one that would eventually make questions about their intimacy impossible to avoid. Diana's account gave the story a human voice. The recording would give it another kind of evidence entirely, and once it surfaced, the relationship between Charles and Camilla would never again be dismissed as rumor. By the summer of 1992, the distance between what the public saw and what Diana was living had become impossible to contain. Then a book arrived, Diana, Her True Story, by Andrew Morton, presented a version of the royal marriage that looked nothing like the photographs people had been shown for more than a decade. It described loneliness, an eating disorder, profound unhappiness, and the presence of another woman whose connection to Charles had become, in Diana's view, inseparable from the failure of her marriage. For readers who had followed Diana from her engagement through the births of her sons, the book felt deeply personal. They'd watched her smiling during public engagements, holding William and Harry, reaching out to patients and strangers. What they hadn't been given was a clear explanation for the sadness they sometimes thought they saw behind those public appearances. Morton's book offered one, At first, there were questions about how he could know so much. The emotional details sounded too close to Diana's own experience. The explanation emerged later. Diana had provided information through an intermediary, her friend Dr. James Colthurst. Questions were taken to her. Recorded answers came back to Morton. That changed everything about how the book had to be understood. Diana herself had helped shape the account. Her participation confirms it reflected experiences she wanted the public to know. Once the book appeared, the fairy tale image surrounding the Prince and Princess of Wales began to crack in ways palace statements couldn't repair. People weren't simply asking whether Charles and Diana were unhappy. They were asking how long Diana had suffered, who had known, and why the woman she identified as part of the problem remained so close to Charles. By December, the crisis moved from bookshops into the House of Commons. On December 9, 1992, Prime Minister John Major stood before Parliament and read a statement from Buckingham Palace. The Prince and Princess of Wales had decided to separate. He also said something that now sounds almost impossible to reconcile with what followed. There were no plans for divorce. The fact that a Prime Minister had to explain the state of a royal marriage to Parliament revealed how far the situation had already moved beyond anything private. For Diana's supporters, the announcement confirmed that her unhappiness could no longer be explained away. For Camilla, it meant the breakdown of the marriage was now part of the permanent national record. But Britain still hadn't heard everything. A private recording was about to surface, and when it did, the woman standing outside the royal marriage would become impossible for the country to ignore. In January 1993, newspapers began reporting the contents of a private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla. The call had reportedly taken place in 1989, while Charles was still married to Diana, and Camilla was still married to Andrew Parker Bowles. Material from the conversation appeared in publications outside Britain before British newspapers carried their own coverage. The most intimate details quickly became the subject of public discussion. We don't need to repeat them. What matters isn't the language people found embarrassing. It's what the conversation revealed. They weren't speaking like distant acquaintances. They weren't exchanging the polite words expected between people connected only by family friendships. The call suggested an emotional and intimate relationship that made official distance impossible to maintain. For Diana, it supported the fear she'd already described. For Charles, it created a serious public problem. He was the heir to the throne, a married man, a future leader of an institution that demanded its senior figures represent stability. For Camilla, the consequences were different in kind. She wasn't protected by a constitutional position. She didn't have the public affection Diana had earned. She had no official role through which the country could understand her beyond the relationship itself. The recording also represented a profound invasion of privacy. A conversation intended to remain personal had been turned into public property. The humiliation didn't belong to one person. It reached families whose children hadn't chosen any part of the attention gathering around them. But once the intimacy became undeniable, the public story sharpened. Charles was criticized, certainly. He remained a prince, the father of William and Harry, the man expected to become king. Camilla increasingly became the person onto whom the relationship's entire moral weight was placed. He was treated as a royal figure who'd behaved badly. She was treated as the woman who embodied the behavior. A complicated history involving 2 marriages, conflicting loyalties, and a deeply unhappy princess was compressed into something newspapers could communicate in a single breath. Diana was the injured wife. Charles was the unfaithful husband. Camilla was the other woman. For many people, those roles felt clear enough that further questions seemed unnecessary. The recording seemed to provide all the confirmation an angry public needed. For the palace, silence was becoming harder to sustain. The relationship had moved beyond rumor. The separation had been acknowledged, and Charles was approaching a moment when he would choose to speak for himself. When he finally did, his words would change the public argument again. But they wouldn't be the only thing that made 1994 one of the most painful years of Camilla's life. On June 29, 1994, Charles appeared in a television interview with Jonathan Dimbleby. The program was meant to give viewers a better understanding of the Prince of Wales, his responsibilities, the pressures surrounding his life. But there was only one question the country was waiting for. Had he been faithful to Diana? Charles answered that he had, then qualified it. He said that remained true until the marriage had become irretrievably broken down. The distinction he wanted viewers to understand was that the relationship with Camilla had resumed only after his marriage to Diana had effectively collapsed. That was his explanation. It didn't establish that Diana agreed with his timeline, and it certainly didn't answer whether Camilla's presence had damaged the marriage long before Charles considered it beyond repair. On the same evening, Diana appeared at the Serpentine Gallery in London, wearing a black dress that later became closely associated with that night. Charles was on television explaining the collapse of his marriage. Diana was in public, composed and visibly present, while the country absorbed what he'd acknowledged. Charles had spoken. Diana had appeared. Camilla, once again, was the person most discussed without speaking. But something else was unfolding that year, something that rarely received the same attention. Camilla's mother, Rosalind Shand, was seriously ill. She had osteoporosis, a condition that weakens bones and can cause severe pain, fractures, and increasing difficulty with ordinary movement. Camilla later described watching her mother's physical condition deteriorate, the pain, the visible changes, the loss of basic comfort. Rosalind died in 1994. She was 72. The woman who had shaped Camilla's childhood was gone during the same period that Camilla's name was becoming more deeply tied to the royal marriage's collapse. Diana's suffering remained real. So did the loss of Camilla's mother. Acknowledging both doesn't require pretending everyone carried the same responsibility. It simply means refusing to flatten a human life into a single accusation. After Rosalind's death, Camilla became involved with the National Osteoporosis Society. The charity's records identify 1994 as the beginning of her support. That date changes a familiar assumption. Her involvement didn't start after she married Charles, didn't appear when palace officials needed to give her a respectable image, and wasn't adopted after receiving a royal title. It began while she was still Camilla Parker Bowles, while the country's attention was fixed entirely on her relationship with the heir to the throne. At that moment, though, almost nobody was watching that part of her life. They were watching Charles's interview. They were watching Diana. They were deciding what the admission meant for the monarchy and the woman Charles had kept close. While Charles spoke about the end of his marriage, Camilla was living through the death of her mother and the beginning of a cause that would remain with her for decades. But grief and silence couldn't keep the situation suspended forever. Two marriages were reaching their breaking point, and before the next year ended, Diana would describe her own experience in a sentence the country would never forget. In January 1995, Andrew and Camilla Parker Bowles announced their marriage was ending after more than 20 years. Their divorce completed that year. It changed Camilla's personal circumstances. It didn't make her relationship with Charles any easier for the public to accept. Charles and Diana were still legally married. Their sons were growing up under increasing public attention, and the country continued to see Camilla largely through the damage associated with the royal marriage. Then, on November 20th, 1995, Diana appeared on the BBC's Panorama. She sat alone in front of a camera, speaking with journalist Martin Bashir about experiences that had previously been filtered through books, statements, and media interpretation. This time, viewers heard the words directly from her. She spoke about the pressures of royal life. She discussed her struggles. She addressed the state of her marriage. And when the subject turned to Charles and Camilla, Diana delivered the sentence that would follow Camilla for the rest of her public life. Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. No complicated explanation. No long timeline. No need to identify every moment the marriage had been damaged. The meaning was immediately understood. For people who had watched her grow from a young bride into a mother whose unhappiness had become increasingly visible, those words seemed to explain everything. They came from Diana herself. They carried the weight of lived experience, and they placed Camilla directly inside the public understanding of why the marriage had failed. But the history of that interview became more complicated years later. In 2021, an independent investigation led by Lord Dyson found that deceptive methods had been used to secure the interview. Fabricated bank statements were shown to Diana's brother, Earl Spencer. Misleading information played on Diana's fears. The BBC accepted the findings. That changes how the interview must be understood, but not in a simple way. Diana said what viewers heard her say. The recording is real. Her description of the marriage belongs to the historical record, but the circumstances in which the interview was obtained involved documented deception, and those circumstances matter because Diana was already vulnerable, isolated, and struggling with questions of trust. Both realities coexist. Diana spoke authentically about what she believed and felt. The person who secured the interview used methods an independent investigation condemned. Neither fact erases the other. But what Diana's words accomplished was more powerful than any formal statement could have been. She was no longer being spoken for by biographers or interpreted through palace announcements. She was looking directly at the country and describing a marriage she believed had contained someone else. Camilla didn't respond with a competing interview. She didn't offer a public breakdown of the relationship's history. So the account most people carried forward was the one spoken by the princess they already felt protective toward. After the broadcast, the pressure became impossible for the royal family to manage. Queen Elizabeth supported moving toward a formal divorce. On August 28, 1996, the marriage legally ended. The ceremony at St. Paul's, the years of public appearances, the effort to preserve an official partnership, all of it reached its conclusion. Charles and Diana were no longer husband and wife, but the emotional arguments surrounding their marriage didn't end with the legal paperwork. Diana was still alive, still a mother, still shaping a public life of her own. And for millions of people, the story remained unfinished. Almost exactly 1 year later, she would be gone. And everything the country believed about Charles, Camilla, and the marriage Diana had described would harden into something far more difficult to change. On August 31, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died in Paris. She was 36 years old. For William and Harry, the loss wasn't a headline or a constitutional question. It was the death of their mother. William was 15. Harry was 12. Flowers accumulated outside royal residences. Strangers gathered, left handwritten messages, shared grief with people they'd never met. Many had watched Diana marry, seen her hold her sons, recognized her warmth with children and patience and people who usually stood far outside royal circles. Now they were mourning someone who had seemed unusually real, even while living inside one of the world's most closely guarded institutions. But grief rarely arrives alone. For many people, it brought back everything they believed Diana had suffered: the isolation, the failed marriage, the feeling that she hadn't always been protected when she needed protection most. And because Camilla had become so closely associated with that painful history, the public's anger toward her intensified. That doesn't mean Camilla caused Diana's death. She didn't. But it explains why an already damaged reputation became almost impossible to separate from the country's grief. The polling captured a public mood that words alone can't fully convey. Between September 4th and 5, while Britain was preparing for the funeral, Maury interviewed 1,063 adults. These weren't opinions measured years later, after emotions had settled. They were recorded during the very week the country was trying to absorb what had happened. Diana received a favorable rating of 90%. Camilla's was 13%. 57% viewed Camilla unfavorably. The remaining 30% didn't express a clear opinion, and when people were asked whether Camilla should become queen if she married Charles, 86% said she shouldn't. Not because a coronation was being planned, not because a wedding had been announced, because the suggestion itself felt unacceptable. For many, the word queen didn't simply describe a future title. It carried the memory of the woman they'd once expected to see beside Charles. Now that woman was gone. On September 6th, Diana's funeral took place at Westminster Abbey. At the center of it were two sons who couldn't step away from their grief for even a moment. William and Harry weren't symbols to the people watching. They were children who had lost their mother. That emotional protectiveness would influence how the public viewed anyone connected to Diana's former marriage for years afterward. Especially Camilla. Every future decision involving Charles would be judged against a question nobody could answer comfortably. What would this mean for William and Harry? There was no way for Camilla to step forward without appearing, to some observers, as though she was benefiting from a tragedy. Yet there was no honest way to pretend Charles's relationship with her no longer existed. The numbers made one thing unmistakable. In the days between Diana's death and her funeral, the prospect of Queen Camilla wasn't merely unpopular. For most of the country, it was unthinkable. And before Camilla could appear beside Charles in public, someone much closer to Diana would enter the picture: her eldest son. By June 1998, less than a year after Diana's death, William was still adjusting to a life that had changed forever. He was also the future king. Contemporary reporting described a meeting between William and Camilla at St. James's Palace. The fact that it reportedly happened mattered, but what it meant privately is a different question. We don't know whether William welcomed it, resisted it, or considered it anything more than a situation he couldn't avoid. A meeting isn't an endorsement. For William, the stakes were intensely personal. For Charles, they were also public. Any suggestion that his relationship with Camilla was being advanced without regard for his sons would have carried devastating consequences. But keeping every part of that relationship hidden indefinitely wasn't realistic either. The question was how to move forward without appearing to erase what had come before. 7 months later, Britain got an answer, or at least the first carefully managed version of one. On January 28, 1999, Charles and Camilla attended a birthday celebration for Camilla's sister at the Ritz in London. When the evening ended, they left together. Outside, roughly 200 members of the press were waiting. The photographs traveled fast. They sent a message that didn't require a formal announcement. Charles wasn't treating Camilla as someone who had to remain permanently hidden. But this wasn't a spontaneous discovery by photographers who happened to walk past. Planning had taken place. Charles's aide, Mark Bolland, was involved in the wider effort to make the relationship more publicly acceptable. The Ritz appearance became known as Operation Ritz. That detail changes how we understand the story. Camilla's public image wasn't simply abandoned to fate. People around Charles were thinking carefully about how the relationship should be presented, when the couple should be seen, and how familiarity might soften resistance over time. Personal silence and organized reputation management aren't the same thing. Camilla could avoid a confessional interview while a professional operation introduced her to the public in a more controlled way. Both things were happening simultaneously. Understanding that prevents the story from becoming another oversimplification. This wasn't one woman single-handedly overcoming public anger through quiet dignity alone. It was a gradual effort involving Charles, advisors, timing, and the recognition that public opinion could shift through repeated exposure. The Ritz appearance didn't suddenly make Camilla popular. It didn't resolve what William and Harry felt, and it didn't settle the argument about Diana. But the photographs couldn't be unseen. And once Charles had crossed that line, the next question became harder to avoid. His sons mattered. Public opinion mattered. His advisors mattered, but there was one person whose approval carried a different kind of weight entirely: his mother. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. At this point in the story, do you see Camilla's silence as genuine restraint, or were those carefully managed appearances a defense without words? Share your perspective in the comments, especially if you remember watching these events unfold at the time. Your memories matter here. The more difficult question was whether the Queen would ever acknowledge Camilla publicly. For Elizabeth, this wasn't simply a family matter. It involved the heir to the throne, 2 young princes, public confidence, and the memory of a woman whose death had shaken the monarchy itself. Any visible gesture would be examined for meaning. In 2000, one came. Elizabeth and Camilla were both present at a birthday gathering for former King Constantine of Greece. Contemporary reporting, supported by palace confirmation, treated their encounter as a notable development, not because it proved they'd never met under any circumstances, but because the timing placed it after Charles's relationship with Camilla had become politically sensitive. The Queen wasn't making a speech. She wasn't announcing an engagement, but she was no longer maintaining complete public distance. Within royal life, even a limited gesture can carry considerable weight. Elizabeth had spent decades understanding that appearances aren't merely appearances when the future of the monarchy is at stake. Recognition from the Queen was significant, but it couldn't answer the public's next question alone. Who was Camilla when she wasn't being discussed as Charles's partner? By then, an answer had already been developing. Her support for the National Osteoporosis Society, which had begun in 1994, had deepened. She became a patron in 1997 and president by October 2001. That progression reflected sustained commitment across years, not a single appearance arranged for a favorable photograph. In 2002, she addressed an osteoporosis conference in Portugal. The subject she chose wasn't Charles, wasn't Diana, wasn't the accusations that had followed her for so long. 3. She spoke about the illness that had devastated her own family. For years, the public had heard other people describe Camilla: former staff, commentators, biographers, royal observers. Now she was using her own voice. But she wasn't using it to settle old scores. She was drawing attention to a condition that too often remained poorly understood until someone's health had already been seriously damaged. That choice revealed something about the public role she was constructing. She wasn't asking people to reconsider the past through a televised explanation. She was giving them a different context in which to see her. A woman supporting patients, a daughter speaking about the effects of disease. A commitment can be sincere and still change how someone is viewed. Those realities aren't contradictory. By this stage, Camilla's position had shifted in ways that would have seemed difficult to predict just a few years earlier. Charles had appeared beside her. The Queen had acknowledged her publicly, and she'd begun developing a public identity attached to work, not only controversy. The palace was becoming more comfortable with her place inside the family. Outside it, she was still largely understood through a story that had begun decades earlier. The woman behind the title remained two people at once, one fixed inside the emotional history of Charles and Diana, the other developing through years of royal responsibilities. Neither version erased the other, but there was still another question the country couldn't avoid. What would happen if Charles actually married her? And if he did, what would she become when he became king? When Charles and Camilla announced their engagement in 2005, the question wasn't simply whether they should marry. It was what their marriage would mean for the monarchy itself. The answer offered at the time was carefully designed to manage public concern. It was announced that Camilla was expected to be known as Princess Consort when Charles became king. That wording matters. Princess Consort was presented as an intended future arrangement, not a permanent law, not an unbreakable legal barrier. But politically and emotionally, it served a clear purpose. It told the public that marriage didn't necessarily mean Camilla would take the position many people had expected Diana to occupy. Now hold that thought. Remember that coronation invitation, the hand-painted flowers, the rosemary, the carefully arranged symbols. In 2005, the words that would eventually appear on that invitation weren't the words the palace was asking the public to expect. That gap between reassurance and eventual reality is one of the most important threads in this entire story. The polling explains why the reassurance was needed. An Ipsos Mori survey in April 2005 found that 63% supported Charles and Camilla marrying. A significant shift. Britain was prepared to accept that two adults with a long relationship should be allowed to marry. But when asked whether Camilla should become queen, only 23% supported it. 64% opposed. Marriage and queenship weren't the same question. A wedding could be understood as a personal decision. A crown involved constitutional symbolism and the unresolved place Diana still held in the national memory. Many people could accept Camilla as Charles's wife without accepting that she should one day be called queen. The wedding took place on April 9, 2005. Charles was 56. Camilla was 57. They married in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, followed by a service of prayer and dedication at St. George's Chapel. Queen Elizabeth attended the religious service and hosted the reception. Her absence from the civil ceremony attracted attention, and it's sometimes presented as proof of personal rejection. The evidence doesn't support such a simple conclusion. Whatever considerations shaped the arrangement, Elizabeth participated in the later service and hosted the celebration. Those aren't the actions of someone maintaining complete separation. Camilla's new public title was Duchess of Cornwall, a choice that gave her a distinct identity while avoiding the name so strongly associated with Diana. Recognize the relationship. Avoid appearing to replace Diana. Give Camilla a position. Reassure the public that the most emotionally charged title remained off the table. The country had crossed a line that once seemed impossible. Camilla had a formal place within the royal family, but marriage couldn't erase the question that had followed her for years. And 2 years later, that question would stop being theoretical when an invitation connected directly to Diana forced Camilla to make a choice. In 2007, William and Harry prepared to mark 10 years since their mother's death. They weren't children anymore. William was 25, Harry was 22. But the anniversary belonged to the same loss they'd carried since 1997. A memorial service was planned, and one question began drawing attention away from everything else. Would Camilla attend? She'd been married to Charles for more than 2 years. She had a recognized position within the royal family. She'd initially accepted an invitation, but for many people, a service remembering Diana wasn't the right place for the woman associated with the breakdown of her marriage. Whether that criticism was entirely fair wasn't the immediate point. The real question was whether Camilla's attendance would turn the cameras away from Diana. As criticism grew, Camilla made a public decision. She withdrew. In her statement, she explained that she wanted to support William and Harry, but believed her attendance could divert attention from the purpose of the occasion. That purpose, she said, was to focus on the life and service of Diana. Notice what she chose not to do. She didn't insist that her critics had misunderstood her. She didn't argue that, as Charles's wife, she had every right to attend. She acknowledged that her presence might change the meaning of the day. and then she removed herself from it. The decision also revealed something about the limitations of royal acceptance. A marriage could be recognized, a title could be granted, a public role could expand. But there were still occasions when Camilla's presence carried more emotional weight than any official explanation could manage. She didn't try to win that argument. She stepped aside. Diana's memorial wasn't the place to settle the past. The service belonged to Diana's life and to the sons who wanted her remembered. Camilla had learned when stepping back mattered. The harder question was what she could build while Diana's absence remained impossible to ignore. There's a difference between being accepted into the royal family and becoming useful to it. A wedding provides the first, the second takes years. After becoming Duchess of Cornwall, Camilla faced a problem no ceremony could solve. The public already knew her name. But most of what they associated with it had nothing to do with the work she was expected to perform. That identity couldn't be built overnight. It grew through individual visits, patronages, community relationships, and causes that gradually accumulated into something larger. Health remained central, but her interests extended beyond any single illness. She supported literacy initiatives. She visited community groups and charities serving people whose needs rarely attracted sustained national attention. She took on commitments involving animal welfare, older people, and women facing difficult circumstances. Many of these engagements were ordinary: a school visit, time with a community organization, a conversation with charity staff, a ceremonial engagement that mattered deeply to the people attending even if it received little coverage beyond local news. Over time, those appearances changed the settings in which the public encountered her. Camilla was no longer visible only beside Charles at formal occasions. She could be seen meeting volunteers, supporting health campaigns, representing organizations that relied on public attention. For years, her identity had been defined through a relationship. Working royal life offered the possibility of being understood through responsibilities. The royal family's official records now list more than 100 charities and organizations connected to Camilla through patronages and presidencies. That number wasn't produced by one publicity campaign. It reflects commitments accumulated across years. Inside the institution, the development received formal recognition. In 2012, Elizabeth appointed her a Dame Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, an honor recognizing personal service to the monarch. In 2016, she was appointed to the Privy Council, the formal body that advises the sovereign. Those appointments signaled that Camilla wasn't being treated as a temporary presence at the edges of the family. She was being given an established place inside its working structure. But official recognition and emotional acceptance aren't the same thing. Someone can receive royal honors while remaining deeply unpopular with part of the public. A charity visit doesn't answer questions about a marriage. A council appointment doesn't resolve grief. That tension remained. For some observers, Camilla's steady presence demonstrated commitment. For others, the expansion of her role felt like a gradual campaign to make an uncomfortable outcome seem inevitable. The institution was moving forward. Many people were moving more slowly. Some weren't moving at all. By the middle of the following decade, two versions of Camilla effectively existed side by side. One remained fixed inside the emotional history of Charles and Diana. The other was developing through years of royal responsibilities. But there was another part of her life the public rarely saw: the family who knew her before she became royal, and the losses that would remind her how much that family mattered. Tom and Laura weren't additions to a royal narrative. They were the center of the life Camilla had built before marrying Charles. As years passed, her family expanded. She became a grandmother. Her children established lives of their own, and the relationships that existed outside palace routines continued quietly. Her sister Annabelle remained a constant presence, connected to Camilla through decades of shared history that predated every headline. That continuity became especially important in 2014, when Camilla's brother, Mark Shand, died at 62. Mark was known for conservation work, particularly efforts to protect elephants. His death removed someone who'd been part of Camilla's life since childhood. A woman often discussed through one controversial relationship had also lost her brother. Her family history contained grief that existed independently of any public argument. In 2017, Camilla acknowledged something that had remained largely outside her public statements: the emotional toll of years of hostility. She described that period as a deeply unpleasant time and indicated how difficult it had been to live under such intense scrutiny. Those comments complicate the idea that she never said anything. She admitted the scrutiny had been painful. But speaking about the experience of being attacked is different from defending the decisions that led to the anger. She still didn't offer a detailed account of the affair or publicly answer Diana's accusations. She spoke about what it felt like to live beneath the attention. One concerns personal suffering, the other concerns responsibility. Recognizing the first doesn't automatically resolve the second. By 2022, she was also sharing occasional glimpses of family routine, playing Wordle with a granddaughter, talking about reading and the quieter parts of her day. Ordinary details that rarely fit the public image of royalty, but help explain how families stay close. None of that settles historical responsibility. Family warmth doesn't erase past consequences. But these details offer something the louder narrative always left out. A picture of someone who was also a sister grieving her brother, a mother maintaining relationships with her children, and a grandmother finding simple ways to remain present in younger lives. Those roles existed alongside the criticism. They didn't protect her from it. But they defined a part of her identity that didn't depend on public approval. Camilla rarely discussed her own suffering in public, but another group of women would soon become the focus of the work she seemed most determined to pursue. Women whose pain had too often been overlooked, and whose experiences demanded more than sympathy. Some royal causes are comfortable to discuss. Supporting books, gardens, and community celebrations rarely forces an audience to confront the worst things people can do to one another. Sexual violence and domestic abuse are different. Camilla chose to make those issues a significant part of her work. And one of the clearest examples began with something small, a wash bag. In 2013, an initiative associated with Camilla began providing wash bags to survivors of sexual assault after forensic examinations. The bags contained basic toiletries, a toothbrush, soap, something familiar. They recognized a practical reality that's easily overlooked. After an invasive examination during an already devastating experience, a person may need the most ordinary things. A small reminder that their comfort still matters. That kind of support doesn't make headlines as easily as a royal appearance. But it addresses a real moment in a survivor's experience. Not whether people know a problem exists, but what someone needs immediately after living through it. Camilla also visited sexual assault referral centers, directing attention toward spaces many people would rather never think about. She spent time with groups supporting people affected by domestic abuse. During the pandemic, when lockdowns trapped many people inside homes that weren't safe, she worked to keep the issue visible and encouraged attention toward survivors and the organizations trying to reach them. In February 2021, she became patron of Safe Lives, a charity focused on ending domestic abuse. But one relationship gave the work a human face. Diana Parks's daughter, Joanna Simpson, was killed by her estranged husband. For Parks, the loss wasn't a policy discussion. When Camilla met her, she encountered a mother whose grief had become inseparable from the fight to improve understanding of domestic violence. Parks later spoke publicly about Camilla's compassion and willingness to listen. That matters because it comes from someone directly connected to the cause, not a palace advisor, not an anonymous source. A mother whose family had experienced the consequences of abuse firsthand. Joanna's death also pointed toward a truth campaigners have tried to explain for years. Domestic violence isn't confined to one kind of household. It isn't always visible from the outside. Leaving a relationship doesn't automatically mean the danger has ended. Camilla's involvement helped bring those concerns into royal spaces and public discussion. She listened to survivors. She supported organizations working with them. She used official engagements to keep attention on violence that can remain hidden behind respectable appearances. The documented record shows this wasn't a single appearance followed by silence. The work continued across years. Practical support, repeated visits, relationships with specialist organizations, and attention to people whose experiences might otherwise have remained invisible. For women who felt unheard, visibility mattered. For families like Diana Parks's, being listened to mattered. Compassionate work doesn't erase earlier controversy. But earlier controversy doesn't make documented support meaningless either. The question still remained, would she actually become queen? The answer no longer depended only on public opinion. It depended on the judgment of one woman. In 2021, Camilla launched a reading initiative that brought books, authors, and readers together online during the isolation of the pandemic. The project later became the Queen's Reading Room, consistent with a part of her personality that had appeared in interviews for years. Then, on December 31, 2021, Elizabeth made a more significant move. Camilla was appointed a Royal Lady of the Order of the Garter, one of Britain's oldest and most senior orders of chivalry, and a personal gift of the sovereign. This wasn't a newspaper deciding Camilla had become acceptable. It wasn't an aide arranging a timed appearance. It was the Queen herself granting recognition at the highest level, but even that didn't settle the question everyone had been avoiding. The answer came weeks later. In February 2022, as Elizabeth marked the anniversary of her accession, she released a message reflecting on her reign and the future of the crown. Within it was a sentence that changed everything. She said it was her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort when Charles became king. Queen Consort, not Princess Consort, not an ambiguous alternative to be decided later. The title the public had been specifically encouraged not to expect. The words came from the monarch herself, and they carried an authority no palace briefing could match. Elizabeth connected her wish to Camilla's continued service. She wasn't presenting the title as a popularity prize. She was acknowledging years of work within the royal family. The decision didn't force everyone to agree. For people who still associated the position with Diana, it reopened painful questions, but the constitutional direction had become unmistakable. Later that year, Camilla offered a rare direct acknowledgement of the cost. Speaking to British Vogue, she said, "I was scrutinized for such a long time." She discussed the difficulty of being watched and criticized, while suggesting she'd learned to live with it. But once again, she stopped short of offering the full public account many people had waited decades to hear. Then, on September 8, 2022, Queen Elizabeth died. Her reign had lasted more than 70 years. For Charles, it was the loss of his mother. It was also the moment he became king. The following day, he addressed the nation. In that speech, he recognized Camilla as his queen consort. No return to the earlier reassurance. No suggestion the title remained undecided. Elizabeth's wish had become reality. The institution had reached its decision. The woman once regarded as unacceptable beside a future king now stood beside an actual one. But Diana's younger son was about to reopen another question entirely. Not what Camilla had become, but how she'd gotten there, and who paid the price. She needed to rehabilitate her image. Those were Prince Harry's words in January 2023, during interviews accompanying the publication of his memoir, Spare. Harry's accusation was direct. In his telling, Camilla had sought favorable coverage by building relationships with sections of the British press. He believed information had been exchanged to improve reputations inside the royal family, and he accused Camilla of using stories involving him and William as part of that process. These allegations carried unusual force because Harry wasn't approaching the subject as a royal reporter. He was Diana's son. He'd been 12 when his mother died. He'd lived inside the family whose private tensions were repeatedly turned into public stories, and he believed he'd personally experienced the cost of the competition for favorable headlines. That makes his account important first-person testimony, but testimony still has to be described accurately. Harry publicly made these allegations. They represent his interpretation of events he witnessed or believed affected him. No court judgment has established that Camilla personally leaked every story Harry attributed to her strategy. There is, however, independently documented evidence that Camilla's introduction to public life was professionally managed. Advisors worked on it, appearances were planned, press interest was anticipated. So Harry wasn't inventing the existence of a reputation campaign. The disputed question is how far it went, which private information was exchanged, and what role Camilla personally played. Harry's intervention shifted the emotional viewpoint. The rehabilitation of Camilla could be described as a successful exercise in royal patience. From Harry's perspective, it came with consequences for Diana's children. The public was being asked to grow accustomed to Camilla. Harry was asking whether he and William had sometimes been used to make that happen. His account didn't cancel Camilla's years of public service. It didn't prove every allegation in his memoir, but it prevented the coronation from being presented as a simple story of time healing every wound. Then the invitation arrived. The artwork had been hand-painted in watercolor and gouache by heraldic artist Andrew Jameson. Around its border, flowers and plants formed a British wildflower meadow. Oak, ivy, hawthorn, dog roses, bluebells, cornflowers, wild strawberries, lily of the valley. Among them sat a sprig of rosemary. Officially, the rosemary represented remembrance. The palace didn't state that it referred specifically to Diana, but on an invitation connected to Charles and Camilla, The presence of remembrance carried an emotional resonance many people couldn't separate from everything that had come before. There was another detail that belonged unmistakably to Camilla, a heraldic boar from the coat of arms of her father, Major Bruce Shand. That small symbol connected the Queen not only to Charles and the monarchy, but to the family into which Camilla Rosemary Shand had been born. And at the center of the invitation, two words: Queen Camilla, not Princess Consort, not Duchess of Cornwall, not the King's companion. Queen Camilla, the name that once seemed impossible beside a British king, had been placed there in gold, surrounded by symbols of inheritance, remembrance, and a new reign. On May 6, 2023, those words became ceremony. Charles and Camilla entered Westminster Abbey through the Great West Door. The service moved first through the recognition, oath, anointing, investiture, crowning, and enthronement of the king. Only after Charles had received the crown did the service turn to Camilla. She knelt at her chair of estate. The Archbishop of Canterbury anointed her. The Queen's ring was presented. Then Queen Mary's crown was placed upon her head. This was a coronation. Camilla received the Queen's scepter with cross and the Queen's rod with dove. Escorted by senior clergy and her Queen's companions, she was formally enthroned. Her own family had visible roles. Her grandsons Gus and Louis Lopes and Freddie Parker Bowles served as pages of honor, alongside her great-nephew Arthur Elliot. Her sister Annabel stood among the Queen's companions. The children and sister connected to Camilla's private life were now participating in the public confirmation of her place inside the monarchy. The transformation was complete in constitutional and ceremonial terms. The woman once photographed as a royal problem was seated beside the crowned king. But a crown confirms a position. It doesn't settle the past. It couldn't erase Diana's recorded pain. It couldn't decide which of Harry's accusations were true. It couldn't turn disputed history into one agreed version. And it couldn't require everyone who had opposed Camilla to forgive her. The coronation established what she had become. It provided no final verdict on how she had reached that point. Less than a year later, the monarchy faced a very different kind of moment. On February 5, 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that Charles had been diagnosed with a form of cancer. He began regular treatment and, on medical advice, postponed public-facing duties. For Camilla, the announcement was personal before it was institutional. Her husband was undergoing cancer treatment, but as queen, she also faced growing public responsibility. The monarchy's work couldn't simply stop. One of the clearest examples came at the 2024 Royal Maundy service. Traditionally, the monarch distributes specially prepared Maundy money to recipients recognized for community service. In 2024, the service took place at Worcester Cathedral. Charles couldn't attend. Camilla went on his behalf, distributing Maundy gifts to 150 men and women. Consider how far that moment stood from the public mood of 1997. The woman once regarded as someone who should never become queen was now trusted to represent the king at an established royal and religious ceremony. Not as a companion, but because her position inside the monarchy had become secure enough for her to carry the duty alone. That institutional confidence still didn't mean universal affection, but it showed how completely the situation inside the palace had changed. Later in 2024, the ITV documentary Her Majesty the Queen, Behind Closed Doors, followed Camilla's work on domestic and sexual violence over the course of a year. It showed meetings with survivors, campaigners, bereaved relatives, and refuge workers. Diana Parks appeared. Survivors explained how violence had entered their relationships and how difficult escape could be. The documentary placed Camilla in small rooms, listening to accounts that were often painful and intensely personal. But notice what the film wasn't. It wasn't Camilla's answer to Diana. It wasn't a confession about Charles's first marriage. Even in a documentary that gave viewers closer access to her work, the central controversy of her public life remained outside the frame. She was willing to speak for survivors. She still wasn't offering the complete personal account many people had expected for decades. By July 2026, public opinion showed how far her reputation had moved, and how firmly division remained. YouGov found that 43% of Britons held a positive view of Camilla. 44% held a negative one percentage point. These figures shouldn't be treated as directly comparable to the Maury survey from the week of Diana's funeral. Different organizations, different wording, different emotional circumstances. But the broader change is unmistakable. Camilla was no longer facing the near-total rejection of 1997. A substantial part of the public now viewed her positively, yet an almost equal proportion still viewed her negatively. That isn't national forgiveness. It's division, and it rejects both easy endings. Britain didn't hold the same opinion of Camilla for 30 years. People changed their minds. New generations encountered her through royal work rather than the collapse of a marriage. Years of public service and institutional recognition shifted how she was viewed. But Britain didn't unite in approval either. The crown didn't cause old objections to disappear. A coronation didn't make Diana's admirers forget what she'd said. And royal duty didn't answer Harry's accusations about the campaign that helped make Camilla publicly acceptable. Inside the institution, the argument was over. Camilla was queen. Outside it, the balance remained almost perfectly divided. So, did Camilla truly remain silent for 30 years? Not completely. She acknowledged the hostility. She spoke about prolonged scrutiny. She issued public statements when circumstances required them. And her introduction into public life was supported by a documented reputation effort involving Charles's advisors. Her image wasn't rebuilt through silence alone. It was rebuilt through planning, familiarity, public service, institutional backing, and the passage of time. But Camilla never sat before the public and delivered a complete defense of the relationship that made her controversial. She didn't answer Diana accusation by accusation. She didn't provide a definitive timeline. And she didn't explain what she believed she owed the people hurt by the relationship. Why? Regret? Loyalty to Charles? Fear of making matters worse? Royal restraint? Careful calculation? The evidence doesn't allow us to choose one answer. What it does allow is this. The story contains several truths at once, and not one of them cancels the others. Diana's suffering was real. Camilla's public condemnation was real. The organized effort to rebuild her reputation was real. Her years of charitable work were real. Harry's allegations are part of the record, even where they remain unproven. And the final judgment is still being argued. In June 2026, Camilla visited St. Mungo's accommodation in South London. Inside an activities room, she met residents and staff connected through a shared reading program supported by the Queen's Reading Room. Books had been donated. Shelves had been built around residents' interests. People gathered through stories while rebuilding lives affected by homelessness. Standing among them was a queen whose name still carried everything that had come before: the marriage, Diana's words, the anger, the campaign, the crown. In our next video, we'll return to Diana's own recorded accounts and examine the questions about the royal marriage that still haven't been fully answered. Camilla received the title the public once said she should never have. What she never received was a version of the past that everyone could agree to forgive. If you value royal stories told with evidence instead of gossip, please like this video and subscribe.